Hi there, and welcome to the next lesson in this Windows Deployment Services training course for Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. In the last lesson, I demonstrated how to install the Windows Deployment Services role. If you are unsure how to do this, please see our last lesson. Now that the role has been successfully installed, Windows Deployment Services will require some initial configuration before it can be used, which is the focus of this lesson. The configurations we are going to make will include whether Windows Deployment Services will use Active Directory Integrated Mode or Standalone Mode, where the remote installation folder will be located, and the preferred Pixi settings you would like to use. Some of these settings may seem a little complex at present, but once you get the hang of them, they really are quite easy to understand. The best way for me to explain these settings is to actually show them to you. So I will now change to my Windows Server 2012 R2 server, where I will demonstrate how to configure Windows Deployment Services. This is the same Windows Server 2012 R2 server on which I installed the Windows Deployment Services role in the last lesson. If you recall from the last lesson, this server is named WDS1 and is joined to the techtipsfromwill.co.uk Active Directory domain. To configure Windows Deployment Services, I will first open Server Manager from the bottom left corner and select Tools from the top right corner. From the drop-down list, select Windows Deployment Services. This will open the Windows Deployment Services console. In the left-hand pane, expand the Servers heading. Notice that this server, wds1.techtipsfromwill.co.uk, is appearing in the list of Windows deployment servers. If I select the server, notice that I am currently receiving a warning message stating that Windows Deployment Services is not configured. Until the WDS server is configured, there is not an awful lot you can do with it. To configure a WDS server, right-click the server and select Configure Server from the drop-down list. This will open the Windows Deployment Services configuration wizard. The first screen you will see is the Before You Begin page. This screen will simply remind you of the requirements that have to be met in order for Windows Deployment Services to run on your network. These were mentioned in our last lesson. If these requirements are not met, Windows Deployment Services will not work. When you are satisfied that your network is running all of the required services, click the Next button. The next screen is the Install Options page. From here, you have a couple of options. The option you choose depends on whether your network uses Active Directory. If your network does use Active Directory, you should select the Integrated with Active Directory option. This is the most common method of using Windows Deployment Services. Selecting this option allows Windows Deployment Services to function in an Active Directory domain. If your network does not use Active Directory, you should select the Standalone Server option, which allows you to use Windows Deployment Services without Active Directory. Since this server is a member of an Active Directory domain, and since Windows Deployment Services is more commonly used in an Active Directory domain infrastructure, I will select the Integrated with Active Directory radio button, and will then click the Next button. The next screen is the Remote Installation Folder Location page. From here, the wizard will ask you to choose the location to save a folder named Remote Install. Although seemingly unimportant, you should think very carefully about where you want to store this folder. The Remote Install folder is where Windows Deployment Services stores all of the images that are deployed to bare metal computers on the network. These images can be rather large, so you should select a location that has plenty of available hard disk space. By default, Windows will choose to save the Remote Install folder in the root of the C drive. However, Notice that if I accept this and click the Next button, I will receive a warning message. Windows will inform you that you are attempting to save the remote install folder onto the same partition as your Windows operating system. Although this can be done, it is a bad practice. Microsoft recommends that you save the remote install folder onto a separate partition, or, if possible, onto a totally separate hard disk altogether. To comply with Microsoft best practices, I will select Not to Continue. Before taping this video, I installed a second hard disk into my WDS1 server. If I open File Explorer, you will notice that I have a blank 1TB E drive. This is a totally separate hard disk with plenty of available hard disk space. As such, this is a perfect location to store the remote install folder. One final point I would like to make is that the drive hosting the remote install folder must be formatted with the NTFS file system. You cannot store the remote install folder on a partition formatted with the FAT or FAT32 file systems. If I open the properties of the E drive, you can see that it is, in fact, already formatted with NTFS. For ease of administration, you may want to give the partition a useful name. I have named this partition WDS for Windows Deployment Services. I will now close File Explorer and amend the path in the wizard to save the remote install folder in the root of drive E. When finished, click the Next button. The next screen is the Proxy Dhcp server page. You will only see this page if the WDS server is also a DHCP server. If your WDS server does not have the DHCP server role installed, this page will be skipped. To cover all eventualities, I have installed the DHCP role onto this server. Running DHCP and Windows Deployment Services on the same server is best avoided if you can help it, as it can cause problems if not configured correctly. The problem you have is that DHCP and Windows Deployment Services both use port 67 to communicate with the rest of the network. By design, you cannot have two different network services sending and receiving traffic on the same port on the same server. Why Microsoft decided to use port 67 for DHCP and Windows Deployment Services, I have no idea. To get around this problem, you need to tick the checkboxes Do not listen on DHCP and DHCP v6 ports, and configure DHCP options for Proxy DHCP. This will ensure that Windows Deployment Services traffic does not use port 67. It also configures option 60 in DHCP to allow Windows Deployment Services to communicate with bare metal computers on the network. When you are finished, click the Next button. The next screen is the Pixi Server Initial Settings page. Pixi, or Pre-Boot Execution Environment, is a technology that allows bare metal computers to boot from the network adapter. When a bare metal computer is connected to the network and is switched on, assuming its network adapter is Pixi compatible, it will receive an IP address from the DHCP server. It will then be able to contact the WDS server and download an operating system. This page determines which computers on the network, if any, are able to connect to the WDS server using Pixi. There are 3 options to choose from. The Do Not Respond to Any Client Computers option will prevent all Pixi-capable clients from connecting to the WDS server. If you select this option, you are essentially preventing all client computers from downloading an operating system from the WDS server. The Respond Only to Known Client Computers option allows only certain Pixi-capable clients to connect to the WDS server. If you select this option, before a client computer can connect to the WDS server and install an operating system, it first needs to be pre-staged. A pre-staged computer, also called a known computer, is simply a client computer that has a computer account created for it in Active Directory before it is joined to the domain. This is the most secure method of deploying operating systems using Windows deployment services. In later lessons in the course, I will show you how to pre-stage client computers, so do not worry if this is a little confusing at present. The Respond to all client computers known and unknown option will allow all Pixi-capable clients to connect to the WDS server. Unlike with the previous option, these clients do not have to be pre-staged. If you select this option, you are essentially saying that it is okay for any Pixi-capable computer to connect to the WDS server and install an operating system. By selecting this option and allowing all computers to install one of your operating systems, you could potentially open yourself up to security risks. For this reason, Microsoft gives you an additional option to require administrator approval for unknown computers. If you tick this tick box, pre-staged computers are allowed to install an operating system. However, computers that have not been pre-staged, also called unknown computers, will require an administrator to approve the installation first. In later lessons, I will demonstrate how to do this. For now, I will select the Do Not Respond to Any Client Computers option, and will then click the Next button. Windows Deployment Services will start to configure itself based on the options you selected. This should only take a moment to complete. Notice that on some occasions you may receive a message stating that the service did not respond to the start or control request in a timely fashion. I have noticed that this only tends to happen if Dhcp and Windows Deployment Services are installed on the same server. If this happens, you will need to start the Windows Deployment Service manually. To do this, right-click on the WDS server, point to All Tasks, and select Start. Once the Windows Deployment Services service has started, you will be notified. The WDS server is now configured and is ready to store images. This concludes this lesson on the initial configurations for Windows Deployment Services. I hope you have found this lesson useful. In the next lesson, I will demonstrate how to add images to the WDS server, which can then later be deployed to bare metal computers on the network. If you would like to see more Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 training videos, please feel free to browse our YouTube channel. Many thanks, and we'll see you on the next lesson.